where he predicts almost to a T the disaster of Eurotunnel. Now, Eurotunnel is this tunnel, rail tunnel between England and France, completed almost 20 years ago. Technologically, it's a success, a real disaster for investors. Okay, so they went through one ordinary bankruptcy, which wiped out the common shareholders. Just recently, I think it's still in the process of going through second reorganization, where even the bondholders are now getting wiped out partially because they cannot quite, get enough revenues. And this guy predicted almost exactly. He said, this is 1836. Okay? He says, promoters are talking about building a suspension bridge from Dover to Calais. People were talking about both the tunnel and the suspension bridge in those days, and eventually the tunnel got built about 160 years, 50 years later. Okay? So they are talking about building a suspension bridge from Dover to Calais, but they are forgetting two things. Because one is, engineers always underestimate costs. Okay? Second, they are assuming that they are going to commandeer all the traffic between Britain and France. So the boats are not going to go away, okay? The competition will still be there. They are not going to get the traffic they expect. They are going to lose their shares, okay? You apply it to Eurotunnel, the guy was exactly right, okay? The projections that were made for the cost of Eurotunnel 25 years ago it was started turned out to be too low. Costs were 70% higher than expected. The guy was right on the money. Moreover, the traffic through Eurotunnel today is about half what was predicted 25 years ago. Why? Well, people who were making a prediction 25 years ago actually were pretty good at predicting total traffic across the English Channel. But again, they assumed, well, in those days, you only had these cartelized airlines, which were very expensive, and then you had ferries. So they said they assumed that airlines would stay expensive, and they assumed that ferries would simply go away. Instead, with the regulation, we have Ryanair and other discount airlines, and we also have modern, very efficient and very inexpensive ferries. So traffic through the Eurotunnel is about half what was expected. And so we have several rounds of shareholders losing their shares on it. So this guy was brilliant. He was right about Eurotunnel, 160 years ahead of his time. But he also applied the same argument to railways. And there he was half right. Okay? He was right, the engineers underestimated costs. The actual costs of the lines that were projected in the mid-1830s, by the time they were completed, turned out to be pretty uniformly twice what had been expected. Okay? But he was wrong about the demand. Okay? The traffic takers, okay, the guys who were reviled in the previous quote from Edward Watkin, they were almost right on the bottom. Okay? They were better in their estimates than modern traffic planners are, with all their computerized models and demographics and census data and everything else. And they were right by a combination of mistakes. Okay? So it's still another interesting story. So the traffic takers were right. So the promoters in the mid-1830s were promising investors 15% returns. Well, okay, what happened instead with the cost overruns, the actual returns were about 5%, but that was pretty good. The risk-free rate of return was 3%, country was in a depression, people were very happy with 5%, and they seemed to be talking themselves into belief that they were going to get 5%, also 10% eventually too. Okay? So, partially as a result of not analyzing what happened carefully, the kind of railway investors of the 1840s came to believe that the projections were going to be right this time. Okay? So they had reasons to trust traffic takers, and they also talked into believing that engineers had learned a lesson. Yes, during the 1830s, that was the early days of railways, things were not understood very well, but now we know how to do it right, we know how to do it inexpensively. Well, it turns out that was not right either. Okay? And what was again interesting here, so we come to the 1840s, so that sort of explains why bulk of the investors were very interested in railways. And what happens is there are lots of very influential skeptics during the great railway mania of the 1840s. In particular, we have the Times of London, which had unparalleled influence in those days. It had a kind of daily circulation as large as of all the other London daily newspapers, okay? And was on its way towards even greater domination. You had The Economist, perhaps the most perceptive critic in many ways of the mania. And then you had a very interesting guy named James Morrison, perhaps the world's richest person. Okay? The problem is these guys, they were using arguments which are counterproductive. And to some extent they got into another kind of collective hallucination. They persuaded themselves that the danger of the railway mania was different than what it really was. Okay? And the danger that they propounded to the country probably stimulated extra investment. How did it happen? Well, James Morrison, mentioned, he's a very interesting guy. He was actually one of the main financiers of American economic development during that period. Immensely wealthy guy, very perceptive. He gave a talk in Parliament in 1836 where he was, I think, the first person in history to point out some of the special features of the railway economy, the natural monopoly doctrine effectively, etc. His main concern was high costs, high charges on railways. And again, to appreciate it, you have to know a little bit more about it. He was the Sam Walton of his era. So he made his money by quick turnover, relatively low profits. He helped to actually break the kind of stranglehold of some of the old traders who were maintaining high profit margins. Okay? So he was a great believer in free enterprise system. He believed, fast turnover, innovation, serving the people, relatively low profit margins, and high total profits. That was his belief. What he was concerned about is high profits on railways would come from high charges, and that would strangle economy. Okay? He was concerned about railways kind of stifling the free enterprise system. Okay? And so he was advocating that Parliament impose limits on railway profits. Well, first of all, he was wrong about his predictions, but of course that wasn't apparent at the time. The problem is, if you're an investor, the prospect of exorbitant profits is not exactly something that's going to discourage you, from building a railway. Okay. Now, as the mania was unfolding, he, together with the Times and the Economist, and apparently they communicated. He was may have been the glue that got all these people talking to each other. They got concerned about excessive spending. So they were concerned that yes, railways were good. And by the way, he was a great enthusiast about railways. He was not like those guys who were denigrating railways as destroying the old social order or polluting the countryside or many of the other things. Okay, he was a great supporter of it. He felt they were revolutionizing society in a proper way and so on. I mentioned he was very much a supporter of free enterprise, so-called a radical, real kind of free marketer, and a smuggler and some other things interesting about him too. Okay, so he and the Times and the Economist and some other people waged this campaign saying, yes, railways are good, okay, but we as a nation cannot afford to invest this much money. It's going to kind of starve the rest of the economy of capital. And we're calling on Parliament to limit in railway investment. So here you are, if you're a railway investor, look at these influential people, we say, these guys, they are not saying that the investment is going to be bad for me. They are simply saying that for the goods of society, I should hold back. And they are asking government to step in. What's the rational response? You rush through the door before it slams shut, right? And that's what the investors did. Okay? And none of these people saw that the railway investors were going to lose their shirts. Okay? But there were very clear signs of that. And there may have been one guy who may have seen it. Okay? How could you have seen it? Okay? Well, here is kind of a very rough outline. There's much more detail, again, has to do with the techniques used by the traffic takers, etc. If you look at the revenues of the railway industry in Britain, it was advancing quite nicely. It was £4.5 million in 1843, £5 million in 1844, and £6.2 million in 1845. But now, remember, that's when the big investment push was occurring. And when you look at the implicit investor expectations for the industry, they were expecting total revenues by 1850, when all the construction was supposed to be completed, of about 30 to 50 million pounds. Because that's ludicrous. Okay? And to put it into perspective, British gross domestic product at that time was 500 million pounds. British national budget was about 50 million pounds. And the Brits were the most highly taxed country in the world. I mean, of course, today, 10% of GDP for national government, that's laughable for somebody living in the United States, where it's 20%, and in Europe, where it's 30, 40, or even 50%, etc. But those are very different world. That's the case. So this was really ludicrous. And then, actually, when you go in, that should have set them thinking and investigating, but they didn't. And this is really quite noticeable. Nobody was looking forward to what happens when you actually build the railways. They were taking the macro view, how much money we're spending on the railways. They were not taking the macro view, what's going to happen once we actually build these railways. And I have some quotes. For example, The Economist in 1848 or 49 finally says, no, now it's time for us to look at what happens forwards, and makes a hash of things too. Okay, but it sometimes admits that indeed they haven't been thinking about it, but they should have been. And had they really thought about it, they would have realized that there was something wrong, and had they investigated, had they looked at the methodology of the traffic takers, they would have realized why it was going wrong. And there may have been one person who may have realized it, and it's almost another lecture, I won't go into it. There was a chap called Dionysius Lavner, very interesting character. First book-length biography from is being written by Anna Martin in England right now, who wrote a survey of railway industry in 1846, at a time when it was still possible to stop construction. People could still hold back had they thought about it. And in it, he's the only one basically of that period who points out, look, once you build, there'll be need of these huge revenues. Okay? And he points down in a very skeptical tone of voice, and then he concludes with this kind of enigmatic statement. This subject opens many curious and interesting views, but our limits warn us that we must at present dismiss it. And he stops. Did he understand all the other depths of the problem, what was really going on? I'm not sure. But he was certainly one of the few people who was very well equipped to do it. He really understood, was involved with railway industry, understood how it operated, knew traffic takers, etc. The interesting thing is his paper gets published in a very prominent publication, most prestigious publication of the time, the Edinburgh Review. It gets very widely read, reviewed, quoted. It has a wealth of material. It was the best kind of survey of the industry of that period. I have a version of it on my homepage if you want to look at it, about 50 or 60 pages. And it's just a small period, small little passage there. Okay, it's buried among all sorts of other interesting things. None of the English reviewers seem to really notice this particular passage, but at least two American ones seem to. Okay? Somehow being removed across the Atlantic puts them far away enough from the collective hallucination of British investors to give them a kind of a sober view and understanding what was happening and why disaster waited. Okay? But anyway, the Brits didn't pay attention. Okay? And so they ran into problems. So anyway, again, there are many more details to it. Mentioned how this all will be documented in the book. Looking forward, if you look at compare the internet bubble to the British railway mania, you see some differences. In one case, you got concrete railways, something very, very concrete, people fairly tangible, versus invisible photons. Okay? And that makes a difference. I mean, the Brits didn't fool themselves like the telecom investors did by overestimating either traffic or capacity by factors of 1,000, which is what Odell's Sigma lectures really implied, etc. They only overestimated things by a factor of 2 or 3. Okay, but they're much more realistic. The expectations for reasonable monetary returns are also, I think, much more realistic too. What happens today is we have far more information than then. Again, this is another lecture I could give about information sources. Information was much more limited. It was very expensive. I mean, there are not a huge number of people who would immediately have spotted the problem. Dionysius Lavner was one of the few in that case. Today you have lots of stuff. You just go to Wikipedia or elsewhere on the internet, you have lots of information. The thing is, people's wisdom hasn't really increased. And among the information, there's also much more misinformation. So information overload. And what you have is, you have situations, again, during the internet bubble, you had lots of people who knew that some of these foundational myths of the bubble were false. Okay? There are people at WorldCom who knew it, there are people at other, other carriers who knew it, but they either chose not to do it for policy reasons, or because it was not convenient, or because they couldn't get